if your application has more than 2 users, which are usually your grandma and your best friend, you want to make sure that you have proper logging set up, because otherwise you're screwed. Logging is not only useful for debugging your application, but also for reasons such as legal reasons. For example, a user made a transaction in your e-commerce website and claims that they didn't do that. You can easily find this transaction in the logs and then later prove them that, hey, I found this transaction. Or for example, for something like security reasons, when someone's trying to breach into your or get into your application, hack your application, you can easily find this anomaly within the logs. Now, with that said, I'm going to demonstrate what a bad log is. So in this case, we have our endpoint called crypto, and we're reaching out to Binance to get a conversion rate from Ethereum to Bitcoin, normal thing. And we're logging something called crypto endpoint has been requested every time an HTTP request comes in using this client that I have. And this is going to be a really bad example, but I also have a good example here. Good example is basically going to spit out a structured log in the JSON format that includes a lot of important things, such as a method that has been used on our endpoint, a log level, for example, HTTP, content length, and most importantly, the timestamp and the URL. This is much better for your production grade application, and let me tell you why. So we're gonna take a look at our application first. Okay, so this is our Express application based on Node.js, and we're using these two libraries, Winston and Morgan. A really short disclaimer, this is not a Node.js tutorial, really. You can actually apply it to any language or framework that you're using. I'm just showing it with Node.js, but effectively, you're gonna have something similar set up for you. So we're gonna set up a logger. In our case, it's Winston, and logger is responsible for formatting things. For example, you can set up a logging level. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. You can set up for formatting. For example, we're going to make sure that we always have a timestamp, and we set up a format of this timestamp, and we make sure that it's always in a JSON format. Transports means where your logs are going to end up. In this case, it's just a console, as we saw before. Also going to talk about that. And we're also combining it with Morgan. What is Morgan? Morgan is basically capturing your incoming HTTP or incoming or outgoing HTTP requests, and then you can tell which fields you want it to capture, for example, method, URL, status, and so on. And then you can add this stream object, and in the stream you say that, hey, I want to use the previous logger that I declared from Winston here, and I'm gonna enrich it with the incoming request and the data that I set up here. All right, as easy as that. And every time an HTTP request comes to one of our endpoints, then the log is automatically going to be triggered, meaning we don't have to do this log or locally. I want to say manually here, like this. Okay, you get the idea. Now, let's take a look at Winston. Winston is basically an NPM package, one of the most famous ones. So I would actually recommend using it. It has a lot of users and a really good community. Now, another disclaimer, this tutorial is based on this article called 11 Best Practices for Logging in Node.js, so definitely go check it out. All right, now let's go to our Blackboard. So let's imagine we have a microservice environment. We have service A, service B, and all of them are outputting their logs into a standard output. It stands for std out. You've already probably seen std out. You've definitely seen this before. What it means is basically a console or a terminal of this machine. So we're gonna put the logs here, but normally you also put the logs into some kind of a file. In the very simple case, it's gonna be just a log file where the logs are copied apart from ending up in the terminal, okay? And then there's a thing called log rotation. Log rotation means that we can create, let's say, a 30 of these files because our retention period is 30 days. So one file per day. And after we reach 30 files, the old files are slowly gonna get deleted because we want to make sure that we always have space and don't run out of it. Okay, this is the simplest way, but now modern solutions, especially if your application is big and you don't want to take care of this log rotation and you have many microservices, meaning you cannot just log into each machine to check the logs one by one. you can use one of the cloud providers, either hosting it your own, like something open source, for example, OpenObserve, or we have a Grafana Loki, or simply paying a bit of money and using something like AWS CloudWatch, all right? AWS CloudWatch or ELK Cloud stands for Elastic. Okay, it has something called Kibana, and what it's gonna do is reach out to your standard output and take the logs, so that later you can go to their own console and filter everything easily by service. All right, now let's talk about log levels. We already saw one of the log levels. So let me open the terminal. We're gonna see that it says level HTTP, but this is common to Winston, not really common for in the world, in a wild world, let's say. So the common ones are fatal. What fatal means is that our application is broken and it doesn't function anymore. Error means that there's an error, but it does function. Warn means that there's a potential that our application is gonna break at some point, so you better take care of it. Info means that some kind of operation started, for example, a database transaction finished, some kind of a synchronization started, and so on. Debug and trace are better for development environments, so never put them in a production environment because they might expose some important or secret data. And they're basically giving some data about performance or what functions, data that functions or method deal with. And simply means that you can actually put anything there just for easy debugging. Okay. And the way you adjust levels is, for example, through your Docker container, where you can pass this log level as an environment level or variable, and then toggle it whenever you want. For example, let's say you deployed it on a production server, but for some reason you want to debug it on a production server. Okay, you usually don't do that, but you can still simply change this from warn or error to debug. And now everything on your production server is gonna be very verbose and debug, basically the debug logs. How do you do that? So previously we saw that when you set up a logger, you can also set up a level. In this case, it's info, but usually in a production environment, you would see something like warn or rather error, but actually a warn is more usual. So warn means that every time there's a warn log within your application, only warn and above levels, meaning warn or error or fatal, is going to be logged out. And in this case, if we go to stream, we're going to see that we're logging every error or every incoming request as info. All right. And here in a try catch block, we are using logger.error. Okay. So means this error is going to be logged out. If we instead say here fatal is one level higher than error, meaning error is not going to be logged out anymore. So this is how you can manipulate the levels also on the fly to make sure that only appropriate things are being logged out, okay, based on your environment. Now let's answer the question, what is a good log and what is a bad log? We already know that a structured log in a JSON format is a good log because it's more readable, even though it has a lot of brackets, it's JSON. But still, there are some notations. When you try to log something, don't make it too generic. Let's say you say user authentication failed, but which user failed? It can be any user. We want to make sure that we at least tell which user failed. Or something like something went wrong. Again, too generic. Let's say unexpected error for order this and this. Instead of saying value exceeds 100, I mean, what is 100? What kind of value? We can say that it's temperature and the safety threshold is actually 100. Or instead of saying operation successful, again, too vague, we can say that this file has been successfully uploaded to this destination. You get the idea, right? Now let's talk about enriching the logs. So every time you define a logger here, this is going to be the bare minimum that's going to be logged out. For example, method, URL status, and so on. But every time the log is happening, you can enrich it along the way. For example, level, timestamp, PID, hostname, message are, no, actually not the message, just these four are like generic global logs. And every time an HTTP request is happening, you can actually append to the logs a request ID and a message. We're going to talk about the request ID in a separate video because this is connected to tracing, meaning one request ID can span across multiple logs so that you can later track this request ID. But you can basically enrich logs on the fly by some extra data that is specific to this log and let the rest of the fields be automatically generated. Okay, now you also want to make sure that in a production environment, so if it's log level warn or error, you still don't put out the error stack trace. Because if a hacker is able to trigger an error and then somehow get access to your logs, or you even return this stack trace to your front-end application, which is really bad, the hacker can see what the stack trace looks like. For example, let's say the stack trace is going to come from Mongoose, and then the hacker already knows that you're using a document database, most likely MongoDB, and even a library Mongoose. And then they can use one of the vulnerabilities that is tied to it. So always make sure that as long as you're in a production, or as soon as you're in production, you never log the stack trace. Okay, and just send a 500. Also, there's a thing called log redaction, not reduction, but redacting or redaction. Redacting. What it means is that you can tell Winston or your logging framework that some fields like password and SSN, you can basically specify whatever you want, don't have to show up in the logs. So it's basically going to be stripped out like this. Okay. And also talking about the cloud providers, this is what a definition would look like in a Docker file. So normal Docker file, we have an image of our Node app. And every time you specify a service, you can also specify logging field and then the driver. So the default driver of a Docker image or Docker containers is called, I believe, JSON log, something like this, but you can also change it to something custom. For example, AWS log. I believe this is going to go to CloudWatch automatically, and then you can also specify some options. This is how your cloud provider is going to work when it comes to observability. All right, guys. I hope you liked this video. If you have any questions, make sure to check out this article. If you still have questions, just write them down in the comments below and I will make sure to answer them as soon as possible. I hope you enjoyed it. Smash like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.